Let me tell you a story. This story is about a small Massachusetts village called Salem, where a group of 20 people were put to death after being accused of the crime of witchcraft. These witch trials have become synonymous with paranoia, religious extremism, and intolerance, all of which was deemed not to be the result of cultural differences or religious zealotry, but the work of the devil himself. Of those executed, 6 victims were men, and one of them has been said to have placed a curse on the town and those who falsely accused him that would span generations. So let's go back in time to examine this legend, because for more than 300 years now, this story still remains extremely strange. The year is 1689, and English sovereigns William and Mary declared a war on France that played out in the English colonies of North America. The ravages of the conflict forced settlers to flee to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, specifically the county of Essex, and home of Salem Village. This influx of refugees would place a strain on Salem's resources, which further inflamed existing hostilities between the wealthier families living there and those who relied on agriculture for survival. In that same year, Reverend Samuel Parris became the village's first ordained minister, and his unbendable piousness, coupled with his greedy nature, did not sit well with all its inhabitants. Rather than accept responsibility for the aggression and disdain that marked the uneasy alliance involving classes, the blame instead was placed squarely on the shoulders of a familiar suspect, the devil himself. So it was that in 1692, Parris' 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began exhibiting some strange behavior, barking, convulsing, throwing objects, and speaking unintelligibly. A doctor was summoned and concluded that their actions were the result of supernatural forces. Soon afterwards, another young girl, 12-year-old Ann Putnam, displayed similar behaviors, and an investigation was launched by magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. The girls immediately held responsible 3 females for afflicting them: a Caribbean slave woman owned by Parris named Tituba, a homeless woman named Sarah Good, and an elderly woman named Sarah Osborne, who was already held in contempt by the townspeople for allegedly having an affair with a servant. The girls were apparently playing a fortune-telling game, whereupon an egg white was dropped into a glass of water. The form the egg white took while submerged would predict whom the girls would marry, and the shapes it assumed would bear suggestion of their future lives. The girls were said to have seen a coffin take shape in one of the glasses, and thus began their rash of hysteria. All of the accused testified before the magistrates over several days, with both Good and Osborne declaring their innocence. But Tituba had a different defense strategy. She actually confessed that indeed the devil had come to her, and bade her to serve him. As a witch was typically not considered to be anyone of color, she used that assumption to then lay blame on the devil for enlisting her services to harm the children. She claimed to have been shown a book with the names of 9 witches that included those of the other 2 defendants, and that their definitive goal was to devastate the Puritans. This was a shrewdly manufactured but compelling story, and with that the Inquisition's accusations and ultimately the executions of innocent people throughout eastern Massachusetts began. One who was accused by young Ann Putnam was Martha Corey, a dedicated churchgoer who, standing in the community, raised alarms that if such a pious woman could be a witch, then no one could escape suspicion. By then, Thomas Danforth, the colony's deputy governor, was brought in to attend the hearings, which included literally dozens of people from surrounding villages who were brought in for questioning. Martha had a somewhat checkered past which was used against her, as she had previously given birth to a mixed-race child named Benjamin, who was in his teenage years at the time of her trial. She went on to marry Thomas Rich, and then upon his death married Giles Corey, who was also on his third marriage. A prosperous farmer, he had previously come under scrutiny for murdering a farmhand, for which he merely paid a fine. After that sordid event came a suspicion of him bribing the magistrate, so he too was shunned by the community. Martha had her suspicions about the legitimacy of the proceedings and urged Giles not to attend the trial, at one point hiding his saddle so he couldn't travel to the meeting house. And as we will see, this would be viewed as her being in league with the devil and trying to protect him. Two men, Edward Putnam and Ezekiel Cheever, interviewed Ann Putnam and asked her about the dress Martha was wearing the day she was attacked. Their plan was to then visit Martha to see if she owned such a dress. But Ann claimed that Martha's spirit had blinded her, so she couldn't see her or what she was wearing at the time. Nonetheless, the men paid a visit to Martha. But as they arrived, Martha was already certain what their presence at her home was all about, and told them she was aware they had come to accuse her of witchcraft. The men did not deny that was indeed the case, and when Martha smugly asked if Ann had told them what dress she was wearing that day, the case against her was all but settled, as in the men's minds, she could only come to know that exact question by means of the supernatural. Almost predictably, other girls who insisted they had been bewitched also claimed Martha was responsible. Through all this, Martha was steadfast in her resolve not to bend to false and self-righteous accusations. When a warrant was issued for her arrest that couldn't be legally executed on a Sunday, Martha took the opportunity to attend church that day as a free woman in full view of all her accusers who could do little or nothing about it. She knew this full well and treated it as an act of defiance. The following day, Martha was arrested and brought before Judge Hawthorne, who was clearly hostile toward her, continuously insisting she was lying before the court. One of the lines of questioning concerned her clothing on the day she allegedly visited Elizabeth and Abigail. When Martha told the judge it was her husband Giles that had disclosed to her the question that would be asked prior to Putnam and Cheever's visiting her home, Giles denied ever saying such a thing. Martha continued to explain her anticipation of the child being asked such a basic question, but her reasoning fell on deaf ears. With that, one of the afflicted girls present claimed to see a man whispering in Martha's ear, and when Hawthorne asked Martha what he was saying, she dismissed it as an attempt by the girl to distract from her testimony. Hawthorne then commanded Martha to confess in order to appeal to God's mercy, but she refused to do so. When asked why she hid her husband's saddle to prevent him from going to a previous interrogation, she said she saw no benefit in him doing so, to which an attendee shouted that it was likely because she wanted to aid and abet other concealed witches. Hawthorne continued his aggressive line of questioning by asking if she knew of any other witches in the colony and how long she had been in service to the devil. Martha laughed out loud at any suggestion she was anything other than a gospel woman or had anything to do with witchcraft. Her cause wasn't helped by the young girls in attendance that commenced to taking fits every time Martha moved or turned her head or claimed to see a yellow bird flying over her, along with the aforementioned man whispering in her ear, all of which were invisible to everyone else in the building. And with that, Martha Corey was indicted on 2 counts of witchcraft against Elizabeth Hubbard and Mercy Lewis, and sent to Salem jail before being transferred to one in Boston to await trial. For his part, her husband Giles testified against her on March 24th, saying that as he began to pray one night before going to bed, he could not open his mouth to speak. This was followed by an incident in which an ox he owned, not being able to walk, but instead dragging his hind legs as he moved across the yard, only to suddenly rise as if nothing was wrong with it. Then there was the episode where their pet cat had taken ill, with Martha imploring him to strike its head. Giles said he refused to do so, and the cat recovered soon after. And, most alarmingly, as Martha would get up out of bed and pray before their fireplace, she did so speaking no words. And all of this was deemed irrefutable evidence against her. Those roguish young girls soon were up to their antics again, as Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Abigail Williams, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard soon claimed Giles had too practiced witchcraft against them, so Giles was arrested and brought forth to endure his own examination. Like his wife, he too was accused of perjury before Judges Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who ordered his hands to be tied so he could not beguile anyone present with his witchcraft. When his hands eventually were unbound, the girls again went into their convulsion routine, as well as mimicking his movements, apparently uncovering a new weapon in their arsenal. During his inquest, he would begin to contradict his previous testimony against his wife, and suddenly felt no urgency to cooperate as he did during her trial, which, as an aside, also included the conviction of another woman, Rebecca Nurse. Corey refused to continue with the investigation and entered a plea of not guilty when he went to trial in September, using a legal tactic called standing mute, by not responding when asked if he would accept the trial by jury. In response, invoking English law, which deemed that any prisoner standing mute could be forced to talk by employing peine forte et dure, which translated means strong and harsh punishment. The procedure would entail stripping the prisoner of his clothing, laying them on the ground, and placing a board atop them, upon which would be laid heavy stones, increasing the weight until a confession was forced from them. This method would be performed over a number of days. Sheriff George Corwin, the nephew of Judge Jonathan Corwin, would preside over the process, which had not been used in the colonies before now. It was done in an empty field on Howard Street, adjacent to the jail where Corey had been kept. As the stones were laid on top of him, Corey refused to concede, asking for more weight to be added. While this was happening, Corey was excommunicated from the church just as his wife had been 1 week earlier. Corey would continually implore his executioners to lay upon him more weight, as he realized there was no way out of the situation for him either way: be crushed by stones, or confess and be hung for witchcraft. The proceedings became brutal, and at one point, under increasing pressure, his tongue protruded from his mouth, with Sheriff Corwin forcing it back in with his cane. After a number of days had passed, and Corey willfully refused to confess to his alleged sins, he died on September 19th of 1692. Before his death, it's long been said that he cast a curse upon the town of Salem by saying directly to Sheriff Corwin, "Damn you, I curse you and Salem." Corey had already taken steps to protect his land being taken from his heirs, as he had previously deeded the land to his son-in-laws. He was keenly aware of others who had not done so and been stripped of it by Sheriff Corwin. Corwin indeed attempted to extort money from the Corey family by threatening to take their land if he wasn't paid off. The otherwise impoverished family bent to his threats by paying him 11 shillings, which they had scraped together by selling off some of their farm animals. Giles Corey's cruel death did result in something positive, though, as many came to understand that the torturous death of an 81-year-old man at the hands of authorities was taking things a bit too far. and doubts began to set in as to the standards of justice being utilized. In time, rationality prevailed, but not before the lives of 25 innocent people were prematurely taken. 19 by hanging, Corey by being pressed to death, and 5 others dying in jail. As for the girls who were the most prominent accusers, they would admit they had lied about the entire thing, but took the opportunity to blame the devil for forcing them to. It was not until 1801 that the Howard Street Cemetery was established, in the very field where Giles Corey met his gruesome end. Almost immediately, people reported seeing his ghost wandering the field, with legend having him appear before any natural disaster. But what about the curse? Just another inane superstition? A series of unfortunate coincidences? You can judge that for yourself. In 1974, Robert Ellis Cahill was elected the new sheriff of Essex County, Massachusetts. But in 1978, Robert suffered a heart attack and stroke, forcing him into retirement. Being aware of the curse supposedly placed on Salem and Sheriff Corwin, he decided to do some research into the witch trials and came upon some very sobering discoveries. It seemed that many of the sheriffs, beginning with Corwin, met some untimely ends or misfortunes while serving. 4 years after the execution of Giles Corey, Sheriff George Corwin died at the age of 30 of a heart attack. 4 years later, his wife died at the age of 31. John Dennison was appointed sheriff in 1715 and died of an undisclosed illness in 1725 at the age of 35. Michael Farley was named sheriff in 1775 and served until 1789, when he died of an undisclosed illness while serving. He was 70 years old. Bailey Bartlett was named sheriff in 1789 and served until 1811. He was asked to resume duties as sheriff in 1812 and stayed until he submitted his second resignation in 1830. He died 1 day later at the age of 80. Joseph E. Sprague was appointed the next sheriff in 1830 and died of apoplexy while serving in 1852. He was 69. Samuel A. Johnson was elected sheriff in 1892 and served in that capacity until his death in 1920 while still in office. The next sheriff was Arthur G. Wells, who was elected in 1921 and died while in office at the age of 62 in 1930. Earl Wells took office in 1953 and while still holding the position, died in 1964. He was 70 years old. And then in 1978, Robert Cahill had his own brush with the curse, but survived to tell his own story. Obviously, many of these men were of advanced age, and it's more plausible that all died of natural causes, not associated with a curse placed upon their lineage, as many others served their terms and their deaths were long after their service ended. But one can see how a legend can flourish when odd circumstances appear to play into its existence. Nonetheless, reason can't always explain strange forces that permeate our everyday lives, and I believe there's something more occurring outside of our human boundaries. In a broader sense, the Salem witch trials still resonate today because we still live in a world steeped in distrust, xenophobia, religious intolerance, and persecution. I'm sure the people of Salem once felt, "It can't happen here." Oh, but it can. And it did. And while you might have hoped that we would never again be blinded by things like ignorance, hate, and greed, here we are. But the people of Salem would eventually come to their senses, and we might learn something from them.